Brown County, Minnesota, September 1971. The air inside the new Ulm feed store was thick with the smell of sweet molasses-laced cattle feed and stale coffee. It was the smell of a good harvest coming in, a scent of security before the prairie winter locked its teeth. Carl Mikkelsen, 79 years old and weathered as the limestone fence posts on his property, sat quietly on a metal folding chair, nursing a cup of black coffee. He listened more than he spoke, a habit ingrained over a lifetime of watching clouds and cattle instead of conversation. Around the counter, the usual circle of men held court: 9 farmers, the feed clerk Gus Schroeder, and 2 salesmen. One of those salesmen was Wayne Pritchard. At 44, Wayne was half Carl's age, with a salesman's easy confidence and a belief in BT us that bordered on religious. He sold furnaces, big, powerful, modern furnaces that promised a bubble of summer inside a Minnesota January. The talk turned, as it always did in autumn, to winter preparedness, to insulation, to fuel prices, to the damnedest drafts you could never find. Hank Muller complained about the cost of propane for his new ranch house. "You get what you pay for, Hank," Wayne said, leaning against a stack of salt blocks. "You can't fight a Minnesota winter with half measures. You need power. You need forced air." He gestured with his thumb toward Carl, not like some folks trying to live like a badger in a hole. A few men chuckled. Carl didn't react, just took a slow sip of his coffee. He was used to it. For 20 years, his house had been a local curiosity, a war-surplus Quonset hut set over a deep stone basement, like a silver loaf of bread resting on a rock. Wayne, feeling his audience, decided to press the point. He walked over to a bin of children's farm toys, picked up a small, bright red plastic shovel, and walked back to the circle. He held it out to Carl, handle first. "Here you go, Carl," Wayne said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Better keep digging. Looks like it's going to be a cold one." The laughter was louder this time. Gus Schroeder coughed into his hand to hide a smile. Bill Schmidt shook his head, a look of pitying amusement on his face. They saw a stubborn old man clinging to an obsolete idea, a relic living in a relic. Carl looked at the toy shovel, then up at Wayne's confident smile. He didn't take it. "Don't need it," Carl said, his voice a low rumble. "My digging is done." He set his empty cup on a nearby sack of feed, gave a slight nod to the room, and walked out into the crisp September air, leaving the laughter and the little red shovel behind him. What did this old Norwegian dairy farmer, with his grandfather's faded diagrams, understand about thermal mass that a man who sold the latest 175,000 BTU forced air furnaces had completely missed? The answer to that question is not just about staying warm. It's about the difference between fighting the world and understanding it. It's a lesson written in limestone and steel, a story of quiet genius in the face of loud confidence. I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand the profound physics behind Carl's simple-looking home. So stick with me, and if you have a moment, let us know in the comments about a piece of old wisdom you've seen prove its worth. Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive. Carl Mikkelsen was not a builder. He was not an engineer or an architect. He was a dairy farmer, a man whose hands knew the rhythms of a milking machine and the heft of a hay bale. But his mind was shaped by a different inheritance, one that came from a place where winter was not a season, but a defining force of life. His grandfather, Lars Mikkelsen, had arrived in Minnesota from the Telemark region of Norway in 1912. He brought with him little more than a wooden trunk, a set of woodworking tools, and a worn grain ledger. Lars was a man of few words, and he never spoke of the home he'd left behind. But in the back of that ledger, he had drawn, with a carpenter's precise hand, the plans for the root cellar, the jordkjeller, that had sustained his family for generations. They weren't blueprints. They were sketches, filled with notes in Norwegian that Carl had to have translated as a young man. They showed how to dig into a south-facing hill, how to line the walls with the flat, dense stone found near the fjords, and how to create a ventilation system that used the Earth's own stable temperature to keep potatoes from freezing in January and milk from souring in July. Lars had never built one in America. The rich Minnesota soil didn't demand the same ingenuity, but he kept the drawings, a silent connection to the old knowledge. Carl inherited the ledger when his grandfather passed. For years, it sat in a drawer. Then in 1949, with a young wife, Solveig, and a need for a home of their own, Carl saw an advertisement for military surplus. The U.S. Navy was selling Quonset huts for pennies on the dollar. To Carl, it seemed like a miracle. A steel house, ready-made. He bought one, poured a simple concrete slab on a flat piece of his acreage, and erected the ribbed metal arch. That first decade, from 1949 to 1959, was a lesson in misery. The Quonset was an architectural disaster for the northern plains. In the summer, it was an oven. In the winter, it was a torture chamber of physics. The uninsulated metal skin radiated heat away into the night sky at an astonishing rate. The interior walls wept with condensation, a constant film of moisture that turned to thick frost in the cold. Solveig was constantly wiping down walls and windowsills, fighting a losing battle against mildew. Their two young children, Anders and Ingrid, were always sick with coughs, bundled in sweaters even when the wood stove roared. The stove was the home's tyrannical heart. It demanded a constant diet of wood, and the heat it produced rose directly to the peak of the arch, leaving the floor a frigid 20 degrees colder. Waking up in the morning meant stepping onto a floor that felt like a sheet of ice. After 10 years of this, something had to change. Carl could have bought a bigger stove, or framed in walls and packed them with the fiberglass insulation just becoming available. But his mind kept returning to his grandfather's ledger. He wasn't a carpenter who thought in terms of frames and walls. He was a farmer who thought in terms of soil and seasons. He looked at the gentle south-facing slope behind the Quonset and saw not a hill, but a solution. He was not building a modern American house. He was building a Norwegian jordkjeller, and he was going to put his house on top of it. By the early 1970s, the landscape of Brown County was changing. The old farmhouses with their stone foundations and thick plaster walls were being supplemented by new modern homes. The ranch style was king. Long, low-zowed, low-slung houses with sprawling footprints, attached garages, and, most importantly, big picture windows to let in the light. They were symbols of post-war prosperity, built quickly and efficiently with 2x4 lumber and drywall. Wayne Pritchard was the high priest of this new religion of comfort. His company, Pritchard Heating and Cooling, was doing brisk business installing the powerful forced air furnaces these new homes required. He spoke a language of BT-us, of blower speeds and ductwork efficiency. To Wayne, a house was a box. The goal was to pump more heat into the box than winter could pull out of it. It was a simple equation of power. If you were cold, you needed a bigger furnace. The problem wasn't the furnace. The problem was the box. These new homes bled heat from every surface. The single-pane picture windows that offered lovely views of the snow-covered fields also offered a massive, uninsulated surface for conductive heat loss. The walls, insulated with a few inches of fiberglass bats, were a significant improvement over old farmhouses, but they were nothing compared to the thermal barrier needed to truly defy a Minnesota wind chill of 40 below. The attics were often under-insulated, allowing warmth to escape straight up. The entire system was predicated on the constant, uninterrupted burning of fuel, propane or heating oil. It was an active system, entirely dependent on a machine. When the furnace kicked on, a blast of hot, dry air would pour from the vents, raising the temperature quickly. But as soon as it shut off, the house would begin its rapid slide back toward the cold, the laws of thermodynamics pulling warmth through the windows and thin walls. This cycle created drafts, uneven temperatures, and a constant low-level hum from the blower motor. It also created a huge vulnerability. If the power went out or the fuel truck couldn't get through a blizzard, the house was just a poorly insulated shell with no thermal memory. It had no resilience. It was a patient on life support, and the furnace was the machine that kept it alive. The Baumgartners, the Hoffmans, the Klossners, all neighbors of Carl, had bought into this vision. They had installed new, powerful Pritchard furnaces, confident they had purchased immunity from the cold. In the summer of 1959, Carl Mikkelsen set out to fix his metal house. He didn't hire an architect. He hired a man with a backhoe for 2 days and enlisted his teenage son, Anders, for the rest. He wasn't remodeling. He was performing a kind of radical surgery on his own home. The first step was the most dramatic. He jacked up the entire Quonset hut, lifting the 16 by 36-foot structure onto massive timber cribbing. Where the concrete slab had been, he started to dig. He dug straight down, deep into the yellow clay of the south-facing hill. This was not a simple basement. It was an excavation guided by Lars Mikkelsen's 70-year-old drawings. 9 feet deep, with the north wall fully subterranean, nestled into the heart of the hill. He and Anders spent the rest of that summer laying the walls. Not with concrete blocks, but with limestone slabs he hauled himself from a quarry near Mankato. He chose each stone for its flatness and density, fitting them together with mortar and a farmer's patience. This was the core of the idea. Limestone is heavy, weighing roughly 170 pounds per cubic foot. It is a thermal battery, capable of absorbing and holding vast amounts of energy. His neighbors thought he was mad. Gus Schroeder's father, who ran the feed store back then, stopped by one afternoon. "For God's sake, Carl," he'd said, watching Carl wrestle a 300-pound stone into place. "You're building a tomb, not a cellar." Carl had just wiped the sweat from his brow and kept working. Once the stone walls were complete, he poured a new concrete floor. Then came the most peculiar step of all. He directed the crane operator to lower the Quonset hut back down, not onto a solid floor, but onto the new basement walls, creating 2 distinct levels. Then he took a tool no man ever wants to take to the floor of his own home: a saw. He carefully measured and cut a rectangular hole 3 feet by 4 feet, right in the middle of the Quonset's wooden floor. He framed it neatly with pine boards, creating a simple, unglazed window between the main living space and the stone cavern below. Solveig had watched this last part with a worried look. "Carl, are you sure? A hole in the floor? Hole in all the cold will come up." "No," he'd said, tapping the limestone wall visible through the opening. "The warm will." He had installed a steep, ladder-like set of stairs down into the basement, which now served as a massive root cellar and storage area. The house was no longer a metal shell sitting on the prairie. It was the upper floor of an earth-sheltered structure. The mockery from the coffee circle in 1971 was just an echo of the head-shaking he'd endured in 1959. The project was the talk of the township. It wasn't just that it was strange. It violated the common sense of the time. You fight the cold by sealing it out, not by opening a hole to the damp earth. But Carl wasn't thinking about common sense. He was thinking about his grandfather's drawings and the silent, steady warmth of the earth. To understand why Carl Mikkelsen's house worked, you have to understand a concept that Wayne Pritchard, for all his talk of BT-us, ignored: thermal mass. A British thermal unit, or BTU, is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. A furnace is rated by how many BTUs it can produce per hour. Wayne's model of heating was all about production. Carl's was about storage. The limestone walls and concrete floor of Carl's 9-foot-deep basement represented an enormous thermal battery. The total weight of the stone and concrete was well over 80 tons. The specific heat capacity of limestone is about 0.22 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. This means that to raise the temperature of that 80-ton mass by just 1 degree, it had to absorb over 35,000 BTUs of energy. It was a massive energy sponge, and it was constantly being charged. Dug into a south-facing hill, the earth around it never reached the deep freeze of the surface soil. At a depth of 9 feet, the ground temperature in southern Minnesota remains a relatively stable 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the air above is 30 below zero. This meant the basement was constantly absorbing the Earth's geothermal energy. Furthermore, the sun would strike the southern-facing arc of the Quonset during the day. The heat would radiate downward, warming the floor and the air, and this energy would also be slowly absorbed by the stone mass below. Even the heat from the wood stove, used moderately on the coldest days, didn't just heat the air to be lost through the walls. A significant portion of it was drawn down into the basement and stored in the stone. The magic was in the release. The 3 by 4 foot hole in the floor was not a window. It was a passive heat exchanger. At night, as the temperature inside the Quonset began to drop, the principles of natural convection took over. The air in the main living space would cool, become denser, and sink, flowing gently down into the basement through the opening. This displaced the warmer, less dense air in the basement, air that had been heated all day by the slow, radiant energy of the 160,000 pounds of stone. This warmer air would rise through the opening, creating a slow, silent, continuous loop of circulation. Carl hadn't just built a basement, he had built a hearth under his entire house. It was a silent, gravity-powered furnace that required no fuel and had no moving parts. It was a system that worked with physics, not against it. February 1978. The cold did not arrive. It descended. Meteorologists called it a Siberian Express, an Arctic air mass that plunged south, scouring the prairie with winds that felt like they were peeling the skin from the world. For a week, the temperature in Brown County never rose above zero. At night, it plummeted to 25 below, with wind chills hitting 60 below. The snow came with it, not in gentle flakes, but in a horizontal, blinding blizzard that buried roads and snapped power lines. This was the winter that tested every assumption about modern comfort. For the new ranch homes, it was a catastrophic failure. The first to go were the houses on the exposed plains. The wind stripped heat from their walls, and windows faster than their furnaces could replace it. Then the fuel interruptions began. A tanker truck jackknifed on the highway, cutting off propane deliveries. The Klossner's tank ran dry on the third night. Their furnace fell silent. Inside, the temperature, which had been a steady 72 degrees, began to drop. Within an hour, it was 60. By morning, it was 48 degrees. They huddled in the living room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching their breath fog in their own home. The Baumgartners lost their electricity when a line, heavy with ice, snapped in the wind. Their furnace blower couldn't run. The house grew cold with terrifying speed. They tried to stuff towels in the gaps around their huge picture window, but it was useless. They could feel the cold radiating off the glass from 10 feet away. By the second day, their pipes had frozen solid. They were living in a modern house that now offered less protection than a canvas tent. In the Mikkelsen Quonset, the storm was a muffled roar outside. Inside, it was quiet. The wood stove was banked, glowing with a low heat, But it wasn't straining. Carl, now 86 years old, performed his ritual. Every morning before sunrise, he would walk in his socks to the opening in the floor and look down. He wasn't checking the temperature. He was checking for frost. In a normal house, the coldest spot is near the floor. Here, a gentle, steady warmth rose from the stones below. The wooden frame of the transfer window was warm to the touch. There was no frost. Solveig sat in her armchair, knitting. The air was still. There were no drafts, no roaring blower, just a profound and penetrating quiet. A thermometer on the wall read 68 degrees. It had read 68 degrees yesterday, and it would read 68 degrees tomorrow. The Quonset's great thermal battery, charged by the Earth itself, was slowly releasing its stored warmth, holding the brutal winter at bay. A small domestic detail proved the victory. A bowl of bread dough was rising on the kitchen table, a simple act of life impossible in a house where the ambient temperature was plunging toward freezing. The cat was curled on the floorboards directly beside the opening, soaking in the invisible current of rising warmth, the most comfortable spot in the house. The phone call came on the fourth night of the cold snap. It was Henry Baumgartner. His voice was tight with stress and shivering. "Carl? Henry? We've got a problem. Our power's been out for 2 days. It's 42 degrees in our house." There was a pause. "The pipes just burst in the kitchen." "Come over," Carl said simply. "All of you, and call the Klossners and the Hoffmans. Tell them to come too." An hour later, 3 couples stumbled through the Mikkelsens' door, their faces pale and etched with worry. They were wrapped in layers of coats, hats, and scarves. The moment they stepped inside, the transformation was visible. Their shoulders, hunched against the cold, began to relax. The color started to return to their cheeks. It wasn't just the warmth. It was the quality of the warmth. It was a still, radiant heat, not the dry, blowing heat of a furnace. It felt like standing in the sun. "My God, Carl," whispered Martha Baumgartner, pulling off her gloves to warm her hands in the air. "How do you have power? Is your furnace still running?" "Furnace is off," Carl said, pointing to the silent wood stove. "Don't need it much." Henry looked around, bewildered. He saw no magic, just an old Quonset hut. "But how? It must be 70 degrees in here." Carl didn't give a long explanation. He just walked to the center of the room and pointed down at the simple 4-foot opening in the floor. That's how. The 3 couples gathered around it, peering down into the darkness of the cellar. They could feel it instantly. A gentle, undeniable current of warm air rising, bathing their faces. Henry knelt down, tentatively reaching his bare hand into the space above the opening. He expected a draft of damp, cellar cold. Instead, he felt a wave of steady, clean warmth. His face, etched with the certainty of a man who believed in modern machinery, drained of its color. The physical sensation dismantled his entire worldview. He had spent a fortune on a powerful furnace that had failed him completely. Carl had cut a hole in his floor and was living in quiet comfort. "You didn't build a basement," Henry said, his voice full of awe. "You built a hearth under the whole house." For 2 nights, the Mikkelsen home became an ark. 6 neighbors slept on couches and inflatable mattresses, safe and warm while the blizzard raged. There was no gloating from Carl, no "I told you so." He simply shared what he had. He made coffee, Solveig served soup, and they waited out the storm together, warmed by tons of ancient stone. The story of the '78 blizzard and Carl's warm Quonset became a local legend. It wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a lesson. People who had chuckled into their coffee cups at the feed store now spoke of the Mikkelsen place with a new respect. The most important convert was Ruth Bender, the secretary for the local Lutheran church. She was a practical, organized woman tasked with emergency preparedness for the parish. The storm had shown her how fragile their community was, how dependent everyone had become on systems that could easily fail. She drove out to see Carl's house a month after the storm. He showed her the basement, the thick stone walls, the transfer window. She understood the principle immediately. It was resilient. It was passive. It was safe. That spring, Ruth created a new kind of emergency shelter list. It didn't just list homes with generators. It identified houses with secondary, non-electric heat sources, wood stoves, fireplace inserts, and, for the first time, a new category inspired by Carl: homes with significant thermal mass. The idea began to spread. A few families building new homes incorporated some of Carl's ideas, digging deeper basements and insisting on more insulation. The Brown County churches, when planning a new parish hall, included elements of the design, ensuring the basement could serve as a passive warming shelter in a crisis. The spread wasn't a revolution. It was a quiet, practical adoption of an old idea, a seed of resilience planted in the community's mind. What Carl Mikkelsen accomplished in 1959 anticipated, by nearly 2 decades, the core principles of what would later be called passive solar design and earth-sheltered construction. He had created a thermal flywheel, a system that used natural energy flows and the immense storage capacity of the Earth to buffer its inhabitants from weather extremes. Without any formal training, he had engineered a home that was more sophisticated in its understanding of thermodynamics than the machine-dependent houses being sold as the height of modernity. His grandfather's sketches were not just a relic. They were a blueprint for a more intelligent way to live. A home is more than a machine for living. It's a relationship between a structure and a place. For decades, the prevailing wisdom had been to build a shell and then conquer the climate inside with a powerful machine. Wayne Pritchard sold that conquest. His business was built on the idea of fighting winter, of overwhelming it with a torrent of fossil-fueled BTUs. It was a strategy of force, and like any such strategy, it was brittle, dependent on an unbroken supply chain and a functioning grid. Carl Mikkelsen's home represented a different philosophy. He didn't fight the winter. He negotiated with it. He built a structure that understood the winter, that anticipated its rhythms, and used the Earth's own constancy as an ally. Warmth in his home wasn't a product to be purchased. It was a condition to be cultivated. Carl lived in the Quonset until 1991, passing away at the age of 98. Every winter of his life there, he continued his ritual, checking the basement window for frost lines that never appeared, drying his mittens in the gentle current of rising air. Wayne Pritchard continued selling furnaces. But the story goes that in 1989, during another fuel price spike, he was at a trade show and overheard a young salesman, full of the same easy confidence he once had, giving a pitch to a young couple. "You can't worry about the cost," the young man said. "Comfort is about power. You just need a bigger unit." Wayne, then in his 60s, stood listening to the echo of his own voice from 20 years earlier, and for the first time, the words sounded hollow. He never spoke to Carl about it, but the men at the feed store noticed he stopped telling jokes about old farmers living in caves. The Quonset still stands on that hill in Brown County, a silent testament to a man who listened to his grandfather. It proved that the best solutions don't always come from the newest machine, but from a deep understanding of how the world already works. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found this exploration of ingenuity and resilience valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We believe these stories of practical wisdom are more important than ever. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What's a modern convenience you think we've become too dependent on? Your participation helps our community grow. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and building science. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.